Hello everybody and welcome to the ultimate guide to Create Aeronautics. Now, this is one of two videos I'm releasing right at the launch of the mod. We have this video, which is going to go through every single item, block, and feature in the mod in detail, and then I'll have a getting started video coming out shortly after that'll kind of showcase a shorter version about how to just get started with the mod in survival. So, the 1.0 version of Create Aeronautics is actually a small bundle of mods. If you look at your Creative tab for Create Simulated, there are three different categories. First, we have Simulated, which basically adds like the core and all of the main blocks you need to actually make your first contraptions and control them. Then scrolling down, we have Aeronautics, which adds stuff that helps you make planes and airships and really anything that flies. And then finally, we have this section for Offroad, which adds all the different vehicle components that we can make cars, trucks, and any other things that roll. And there's also a companion mod that has to go along with it, Sable, which is essentially the physics engine, which runs all of the physics calculations and stuff that actually makes the mod work. Now, before jumping into all the details of all the different blocks and how they would work to actually build cool contraptions, the very first thing we need is physics, and those are achieved with the physics assembler. Now, the way this block works is you can essentially just right-click to place it on any face of a block. And once you've done that, you hold right-click, and you can basically move this little lever. So you just drag your mouse up and it assembles whatever block it's attached to into a physics contraption. And we can see that in action first by it falling down, but also if I'm in survival, I can actually knock this around and, move it around my world, which is super cool. And you can see that it's actually like interacting with stuff. And this has a lot of use cases. We can do stuff like build cool cars that actually will roll around your world and interact with stuff how you'd expect it to. We can also do stuff like build planes that can fly around your world. And even hot air balloons and airships that can take you traveling all different distances, and they will work so well and look so cool in the mod. Plus, you can also use it for just other stuff that has physics, like this big die I built, which you can actually roll around your world. And these are just a few kind of small examples. There's so much you can do with this mod, and it adds so many different capabilities, and I'm so excited to start digging into it. So let's get started with talking about some other ways to use a physics assembler and how these blocks are going to work once actually assembled. Now, in order to actually build your larger contraptions than just a block, you have a few different options. First, once a block is assembled, you can just build directly off of that, and whatever you build will be part of that physics object. So you can see I can kind of build out here and actually construct whatever I want to build off that initial block. So that's one way you can kind of use your physics blocks. Now, building off a physics contraption is definitely going to introduce some difficulties, because if something topples over like this, suddenly you're trying to build on this side or around the back, and that might be really difficult. So a lot of your contraptions, I imagine, are going to start in the regular world grid. And in order to do that, there's a few different ways to actually connect your blocks together. First, basically anything sticky is going to work to connect your blocks together. So by default, if I activate this, it's just going to fall, not be connected. However, if I were to replace this with a slime block, we can see that this grid is actually connected, and the slime block basically glues all of this together. And an important thing to note at this stage is if you're building and you want to unconstruct something, you want to disassemble it, you can hold right click on a physics assembler, pull it, and it will disassemble itself. And this doesn't have to be the same physics assembler. So if we put one over here, we could even use this one to disassemble our contraption. The other thing that works is our chassis from Create. So if I were to go ahead and stick these together and put our concrete back, and then I assembled it on top, you can see those are all stuck together. So you can also use your chassis to kind of stick your contraptions together. And of course, if those work, your regular super glue is also going to work. So if we super glue this together, we can then assemble, and it'll assemble everything that's super glued together. Now, while the regular super glue from Create does work really well, it does have its limitations. So Simulated actually adds a honey glue, and this does some really cool stuff. So first, it works the same. We can right click one edge, right click another, and then of course assemble your contraption. And that just works beautifully as expected. But where it comes in handy is you right click one edge, and let's say there's an edge or corner that you don't have actually built up. Now you have two different options. First, you can right click, place your grid down, and then just like when you're doing a schematic, you can hold Control and scroll on any of these faces to extend or retract it down. So I can extend this up to contain my full build here. The other way to do this is if I right click one edge and want to right click the other one, I can hold Alt and it'll basically place down the other corner in air. So I can line this up and place down my other corner when it's in line, right click, and we have our contraption assembled. Now with this contraption, I do want to point two things out. First, anything connected on a diagonal will actually glue and be part of that same contraption. So you can see that diagonal piece was connected. The other thing to note though is anything that's disconnected will not be connected to the same contraption. Now this isn't restricted just to when you first assemble it. If I were to build off here and any block is disconnected from original assembly, it will become disconnected and become its own physics object separate from our original build. Now, one thing to note, if I do want to reconnect it or connect one structure to any other, if you hold a slime ball, right click one face, you'll get this kind of little box. And what this will let you do is click another face of another block and it will try to glue them together. And so you can actually go ahead and glue up all these and they will become one single physics object. Now this only works on simulated contraptions. If I were to try to glue anything on the actual world grid, it will yell at us and not let us do it. You have to actually glue contraption to contraption. Now, one really important thing to note with our honey glue is it only works for assembling and disassembling your physics contraptions. It doesn't actually work as regular super glue does. So we have these super glued together. So when this piston comes down, it will stick. And when it goes back up, it'll bring both of these up. But what you'll notice is that does not work with the honeyed glue. So while super glue can be moved by regular Create contraptions, our honeyed glue is always going to be in that same place no matter what you do. So you can see our honey glued stays in that same spot. Now, the last thing to note about honeyed glue is the way it interacts with super glue. So if you have honey glue and it's overlapping a super glued section, so we have honey glue here, a super glue section here, it will connect. So it'll actually take that super glue section and connect it up and take it with it when it's assembled. Now, if we do that the reverse way, so we have these two super glued and these two honeyed glued, the honey glue section will stay in place. So if you have a larger assembly that has super glued and honey glued sections, just make sure that your honey glued sections are the main part of your assembly and the super glued sections are any kind of add-ons, such as wheels or wings that move and stuff like that. Now, along with glues and slime balls, which are going to be really useful for the contraptions you make, there are a few other really neat items that the mod adds. First is going to be the aviator's goggles. Now, there's a lot of information you can gain from your contraptions by wearing goggles, and the aviator goggles work the same way, but actually give you a little bit of armor and also fit the vibe of the mod. You get these really nice goggles that you get to wear on your head. So definitely recommend crafting those up, especially because they're dirt cheap. We also have a music disc, which you heard in the intro. I absolutely love this song. And next we have a creative mode only item, and that is the creative physics staff. And what this allows you to do is right click any assembly and basically move it around. Now, once you have it selected, you can do a few different things to kind of move it around your world. First, you can just look and move it around. Second, if you scroll with your mouse wheel, you can bring it closer and further away. If you hold tab, it basically allows you to rotate it around. So when you're holding tab and you move your mouse, you can basically rotate your item around kind of however you want. And finally, if you left click any contraption, it doesn't have to be one you're holding, it will actually lock it in place. So if I want exactly this angle, I can left click, locks that contraption in place. I can do, whatever I want to it, and then just left click it again to turn it back into a live object. And last, we have the plunger launcher. Now this does have durability, but can be powered with a back tank and air. And the way this works is you right click one spot and you right click another one, and it'll place down this plunger line. Now you can shift right click to basically clear all placed plungers. But what this does is really cool. So if you click one contraption and you click another one, it'll basically pull them together. So if you wanted to move two things closer together, that's how you would do it. So now that you know kind of the basics about how to start making your first contraptions in your world, I do need to pause and talk about some of the different features that the different blocks have. Now, an important thing to note is you definitely want to be wearing the engineer's goggles, because when you do that and you look at any block, it'll give you some information about it. So I can see that basalt is heavy, or I can see that wool is super light, or other more eclectic information like a grindstone is slippery. And there's a lot of blocks that have a lot of different features. First is slime, and slime is bouncy. So anything with slime will kind of bounce up and down like that. And on the flip side, honey is sticky. So if I drop this block, you'll see it'll slide all the way down. But if I drop it in honey, it'll get stuck. And alternate to that, ice is slippery. So if I drop this, it won't go. But if I drop it on ice, it'll slip all the way down a little platform. Now, I did have to use packed ice here because regular ice is fragile. So if I drop some netherite onto some iron, it won't go through. But if I drop that same netherite brick onto some ice, they'll smash right through and break the ice. Now, I was using netherite in that example because if you look at it, it's a super heavy block, and there are a few different weights of blocks. So I have this little scale here where you can see that if I drop andesite onto it, they weigh the exact same. The scale doesn't move. Whereas if I drop two different weights, so a block of netherite and some wood, you can see that our netherite is quite a bit heavier than our wood. Now, there are essentially 6 different classes of weight, and you can see all of these by wearing the engineer's goggles. First is going to be your weightless stuff. So this is like mainly redstone items, and if I look at here, stuff like plants that don't really add anything to contraption, they basically weigh 0. Then we have the super light category, which weighs 0.25, and this is stuff like your fences and your half slabs, basically anything small. The next section is mainly like for organics, and that's the light section that weighs 0.5. So that's stuff like oak logs and really most of the woods. The next section is the normal category, and so this is like most blocks. So like all of our concretes and terracottas, the shulker boxes. If I look at Create, all of these like polished and cut different stones, and really most things are in that normal category. Next is the heavy category, and this is mainly your raw stones, and these weigh 2. And if I look at all of my raw stones, like our mossy cobblestone, or cobblestone, regular stone, even granite, those will weigh 2. And then finally, we have the super heavy category, which is like our iron blocks or your netherite blocks or stuff that just weighs a lot. And then we also have some blocks that instead of weight have the modifier floating. And as you can see, if I were to move this around, it's actually floating in the air. So endstone has the floating effect, which means that it floats. Now, one thing you may notice with your contraptions is fluids do flow on contraptions, as you can see here. However, they act a little bit differently than in the regular world. And this interaction is basically to save yourself from just flooding your world in a weird way, because fluids don't actually flow off the sides of contraptions. So you can see this water here flows down, but will not flow off the side. If I were to like place water over here, you see it actually like flows out onto the contraption itself. It will not just kind of flow into the air. What this also means is that fluids like on the very bottom level won't actually flow, so you're not at risk of creating a big flood in your world. And then finally, keep in mind, across contraptions, a lot of things still work. For example, this press, if I hold it over this depot, it will start pressing iron into plates, even though they are in a different world space, different contraptions. So keep that in mind as you're building stuff and test stuff out. See what works across contraptions. You might be surprised at what actually works doing stuff like this. So now that you know the basics about how the mod actually functions in a core level and how to actually make your simulated contraptions work, we're going to talk about all of the mechanical control blocks that the mod adds in order to actually utilize the fact that they're a simulated contraption in order to build other cool contraptions. Starting off first, we have one of the most useful blocks, the handle. So the handle works in 2 ways. By default, if you right click it, you're essentially grabbing onto the handle. So you grab on and your player move towards the handle. Now, once you're grabbing onto a handle, you can kind of move yourself around the handle by just moving your mouse and position yourself. And this can be really useful to like get on a contraption. Like if you have an airship and you want to kind of get on, you can grab your handle and move onto your airship. Now, an important thing to note is while holding a handle, if you scroll down, you go further towards the handle. And if you scroll up, you go further away. So you can very easily kind of like jump onto your contraption and, tactfully retreat if you wanted to. Now the handle serves a different and equally as useful function, where if I shift and then grab, I'm basically grabbing the contraption itself. So you can see I've grabbed my simulated contraption and I can basically just drag this around with me. So if you need to move something by hand, the handle is the way to do it. And this works really nicely and it's really fun to kind of grab your contraptions. And of course, scrolling also works here. So if I scroll down, it'll come towards me. If I scroll up, it'll go away from me. Handles by default are crafted into the iron handle variant, and that's just an andesite alloy and an iron nugget. You can also craft a copper version and all 16 different die variants of handle. Now, before we talk about the new mod that Simulated adds the swivel bearing, I do want to mention that it's important to note that on a simulated contraption like this, regular bearings are still going to work and will actually interact with the world. So I have this contraption here, and these are just regular mechanical bearings, and yet still the wheels I've built are interacting and physically crashing into the world, causing my machine to work. And if I were like grab a handle and pull this back, if it lets me, you can see that it actually crawls and moves along. So definitely keep in mind, you're not stuck using the simulated bearings. You still are allowed to use mechanical bearings for a lot of stuff. Now, that being said, the swivel bearing that Simulated adds is really quite special. So by default, whenever you make an assembly with a regular bearing, it's like not a real object. You know, you can't interact with it. I can't build off of it. You can stand on it, but that's pretty much it. This doesn't actually interact with the world. Now, what's cool is with the swivel bearing, which instead of interacting with it from a shaft at the bottom, you interact with it with a cog on the side, it turns into a simulated object, which means you can build off of it, which means that like if you have redstone on here, it'll function. It's an actual simulated object, which exists in your world, which is super cool and incredibly useful for a lot of contraptions. And this comes in really handy, not just with the fact that this is a real object, but it has this pass-through shaft. So by default, with a regular bearing, you're stuck to this turning and that's it. But with a swivel bearing, if you put power in through the back, the power will go through and come out the shaft on the other side. So if I were to do this, you can see that this belt is actually going to function. And if I drop an item on it on the correct side, you can see that our item is actually going to travel on that belt working as a real contraption, which is so very cool. You can use this to like have multiple bearings or like a bearing and then a linear chassis or something. And there's so much power you have here with the swivel bearing and being able to transfer power through. Now, your swivel bearing also has 4 different modes you can choose from. You have the default, which is unpowered locked. You have always locked, powered locked, and always unlocked. What that means is, by default, if you're not providing power, it's locked to the swivel rotation it's getting from the cog. Now what that means is, if I go ahead and power this, it will no longer be controlled by that. It will just swivel, hence the name swivel bearing. So you can see our first mode, if it's unpowered, it's locked. If it's powered, it will be unlocked like this, and it'll actually kind of swivel around the world. We also have the always locked mode, which means that it will never be able to be unlocked. We have the powered locked, which means that if it's unpowered, then it swivels. And then of course we have the always unlocked, which means it will always be a swivel object. As you can imagine, this definitely has a lot of really interesting use cases. It could be a giant hammer. It could be a walker with legs that have linkages that are controlled via different means in the bearing itself. There's so many cool things you can do with this swivel function. And next we have another incredibly useful block, the Redstone Magnet. Now what this does is when you apply redstone power, it will basically turn the magnet on and you can see the actual magnetic field it's generating with these little particle effects. Now the way this works is just like a real magnet. Red attracts to blue and blue attracts to red. So if I were to go ahead and turn this one on, because we have blue on this side, red on this side, it will attract and stick together. And now these magnets are stuck. They want to stay stuck together. I could always, of course, unpower just one of them and then unstick it, unpower both, then they're both unstuck, or repower them both and they will stick back together. And just like a real magnet, while opposites attract, the same sides are going to repel each other. So if I turn this one on and I turn this one on, you see that they actually shoot away from each other. So you see that the blue shot away from the blue. And actually over here, it tried to attach back to the red over here, which is really funny. But yeah, so you can see the magnets work just like real magnets. And a really neat feature about these magnets is the amount of power you provide them also affects how intensely they repel and attract. So if I were to go ahead and just like slowly power these up, you see they start powered on, but they're not going to touch. Give them a little bit more power. You can see they slowly start to connect and then eventually connect. And as you saw there, the farther apart, the weaker the connection is. And then the closer they get, the stronger that power connection is going to be until eventually they're just stuck together. Now, if you want a more permanent way to stick something together, that's where rope comes in handy. So the rope system works with 3 different blocks. First, you have the rope connectors, which you can place down. Then you have the rope couplings, which you click one connector and then click another, and it'll basically place a rope between them. Now you can only have 1 rope per coupling. So if I were to place one here, I cannot place another here. I'd have to replace it with a rope. As you saw with that first one, you can also do like weird angles with these, which is really quite cool. Now removing rope is very easy. You just kind of grab some shears, right click it, and it pops the rope off. Now when contraptions are attached via rope, they actually stay connected. Now one thing that's really cool is this entire walkway that goes across my whole showcase hall is all being held up by rope. So these ropes are actually holding up this entire thing as its own contraption. So if you attach a rope to a contraption, it'll actually hold itself up to either a world object or another contraption. Now the ropes also do something very fun, and that's where if you're holding a wrench and you right click a rope, you will actually slide down it like a zip line. So you can see I can just run up here. Now, you can't go up, but you can keep up some momentum, and then eventually you will slide down whatever rope it is, which is really fun to mess around with. And along with kind of your stable connections, there is also a modifiable connection with the rope winch. So if you connect the rope winch to a rope connector, you can then power that winch. So if I were to pull this, and it'll actually extend and retract the rope. So if I were to go ahead and shift right click it, you see it's like letting out slack on the rope. And if I pull it back in, it'll contract that rope, pull it up, and you can basically have a device which can go longer or shorter depending on what you need. And as you see, this is a separate physics contraption that is attached via rope, and it basically just swings there on the rope, which is so cool. And along with ropes, we also have one other kind of, I'll call it an organic sort of connection, and that is with the spring. So the way the spring works is you essentially right click two different spots, and you'll place a spring that kind of forms a spline between those two spots. And this works, as a spring. So if I pull this block down, you see it'll spring itself back up, which is super cool. Now there are some modifications you can make to your springs. First, if you right click it with a wrench, it'll change the weight of the spring. So we have this heavy version where you see when I pull this back, it's a little bit harder to pull and it shoots up and kind of stays upright a lot easier. We have the super skinny one, which is a lot more bouncy. As you can see, it actually can barely, or it can't hold itself up. And then we have the normal version, which is what it was by default and kind of what you get placed, where it's kind of right in between those two. The other really cool thing is if you right click a spring with a spring, you actually change the length. So you can see our length is now 4.25, 4.5, and we can make this a lot longer, or if you want, shift right click and make it shorter. So if we shift right click it, you can see it's going down by 0.25 meters every time, which is a quarter of a block. And you can really have a nice fine-tuned control of the length of your spring. And while I'm already talking about springs, this is a great chance to talk about the torsion spring. Now, the torsion spring does something really cool and is really used as kind of an intermediary between whatever rotation power you have and a bearing. Now, I'm sure that it has many other use cases, but this is kind of the first one that I saw that was really obvious for using the torsion spring. So essentially what this does is it takes rotational power and it does two things. First, it limits the max angle. So you can see by default, it's set at 90 degrees. So if we look at our shaft here and we power it, you'll see it'll only turn 90 degrees. The other really cool thing it does is when unpowered, so if I were to trigger this clutch, it'll return back to that initial point. And I can change this angle. So let's say we only wanted this to go to 45 degrees. If I power it, it'll go to 45 degrees. Unpower it, it'll go back. And if I were to go ahead and reverse the direction of power, it does work the other way too. So now it'll turn this way, 45, and then back to center. And like I said, this works really well on bearings. So you can use bearings to precisely control angle and send it right back to where you got it from when unpowered. And this has a lot of use cases. I mean, the initial ones I see are like if you have an airplane with flaps and you want to control the angle of the flap, like let's say 45 was too intense. We want this more like 14. You can very precisely control that and also put it right back to center when you're done with it, which is a really nice feature. And it's also really useful for steering. Like I created a car and I used the torsion spring in order to control the steering where it could have like 14 degrees to turn one way. And then if I press the other direction, it would like turn the other way. And then if I like let off, it would just turn back to 0 and it worked really quite well. Now that should give you a good idea of how to get your contraptions moving initially. But before we talk about some other ways to get it moving with just using Create, I really want to talk about the docking connector and how to actually dock your contraption. So the way the docking connector works is when you apply power to it, it basically extends out and is ready to dock. Now if there's a mating docking connector, like if I were to extend this one, you see that they pull themselves and actually try to dock together. And these things are pretty strong. So we have this little mock-up of an airship. If I extend my dock, you see that it senses that there's another dock nearby, and they just kind of go and connect to each other. So we could use like ropes or springs or magnets to secure a contraption down. Using the docking connector is going to be like the best, most secure way to keep a contraption locked down to your regular world grid or from one contraption to another, because they do work across contraptions as well as with the world like they are here. Now, docking connectors are also how you're going to move materials across builds. So if I have one docking connector on this contraption and one on this one, they will connect up, and you can see that our liquids do pass through when being pumped from one side and pumped from the other. And this also works with items. If I put an item into a funnel on one end, it will come out the funnel on the other contraption. Now, the other really cool thing about the docking connector is it does give a different signal strength depending on how close it is to being docked. So if I were to like try to dock these two blocks, but this one's being locked, you see it gives a pretty weak signal strength of 3. If I were to let it go a little bit further, like so, it'll go up to 7. And then once it's fully docked, we have the full redstone strength of 15. So all in all, the docking connector is incredibly useful and almost a must-have for a lot of your larger contraptions that you don't want floating away on you. Now, while Simulated itself adds a lot of really cool ways to interact with the world, also keep in mind that Aeronautics adds a bunch more like real propellers and steam vents and hot air balloons, and Offroad adds like the wheels and stuff. So definitely keep that in mind when you're planning out your contraption. You're not stuck to using these. But the one thing I do want to highlight right now is, of course, Create already works pretty well with Simulated. So you can see a regular bearing can make a car. You don't need wheels. You can make your own block built wheels, which is really nice. And the mod even works with treads. So by putting belts at the lowest level of your contraption, they work as a tank. They work as tank treads, which is so fun. We also have a new use for fans because fans now provide propulsion forward. So if we're to go ahead and activate this, you see the fan will blow and our little sled will actually move because of the force generated from that fan. And that can also be expanded upon by using the nozzle. So if you use a nozzle underneath a fan, what it'll do is it'll basically repel itself from all blocks around it. So as an example here, I have this little hover device, which hovers itself off the ground really nicely by just kind of pushing itself away from the blocks. Now you do see itself pushing itself away from those blocks and yeeting itself off this platform, but it still works, which is really cool. And while Simulated has a bunch of really nice integrated features for like mechanical control, it also does have some new features for contraption control, kind of on like the SU and shaft level. Now, the first of these, and honestly the most important if you want a compact contraption, is going to be the portable engine. So the way this works is you can basically feed it fuel. So I can take coal, right click it, and it will generate SU. And it generates quite a bit of stress. It generates 2048 by default, and it works great. Now, an important thing to note is you can change the rotation direction if you'd like. So you can easily change that without needing a gear shift. You can just change it right on the device itself. Now, you do have a burn time. You can see one engine with one stack of coal is about an hour and a half roughly. And a really neat thing about this is if you feed it blaze cakes, it actually supercharges it, which does two things. First, you get nearly 6 hours of burn time with a stack. And second, it generates 4096 SU and double the speed. Speed isn't as important because you could always just gear that up, but still really cool to have. Now there is a new item you need to craft to make this up, which is the engine assembly. And to make that, you just slap an iron sheet with a saw and a press 8 times, and that's it, and you get your engine assembly. Now these do come in all 16 different colors. You get the red by default, but then can dye them into each color you want. And they're kind of menacing. When I put these all together and then I walked by holding coal the first time, I was honestly kind of freaked out the way they just kind of all open their little mouth in order to eat the coal. It's kind of cool, but it's also kind of terrifying if I'm honest. Now, these engines can also be automated. So if I go ahead and feed it either with a belt and a funnel, that works to power the engine, and it also works via mechanical arm. So if a mechanical arm has items taken from a depot and then placed in the engine, it will work and fuel up our engine. Now, Simulated also adds an upgrade to the gear shift with the Directional Gearshift. Now, the way this works is super cool. Depending on which side you input power from, it'll change the direction it turns. So I have input power on this side. You can see that the little rotation will rotate over towards this side. But if I power on the other side, it'll then rotate towards that side. So you can actually get a really nice control and spin your contraption in either way and be able to switch back and forth super easily. Now you will notice right away that if unpowered, it won't turn, and if both sides are powered, it also won't turn. So it'll only actually work with whatever single side is powered. Now, technically, the engine and the gear shift don't really add anything new to Create. You could make these things happen. It would just take a lot more redstone, a lot more space, and it's nice to have them so compact, especially when you start doing stuff like building planes. And this is continued with the analog transmission. Now, what this does is it does two things. It basically is meant to help speed up and slow down contraptions. So the way this works is if I'm feeding power in here, which is at 32 RPM from the shaft, it will power the cog, and the cog is going to power this other cog going at 32 RPM. Now, if I start powering up our analog transmission, you see it's going to start to slow down. So if I power this up to 3, we're going at now 24 RPM, 18 RPM, all the way down until a fully powered transmission is going to basically turn off whatever it's connected to. So you can not only change your speed, but you get a fine control of exactly what speed you're changing to, which is so useful if you're doing something like changing your speed of your propeller or your wheels, and it's going to be really integral for probably most Create Aeronautics contraptions. Now on the flip side, if you're powering the cog, so we have 32 RPM going in on the cog side, and then you power this up, you're basically increasing the speed that comes out the shaft. So you can see as it increases at 7, we're now going twice the speed, and we can go even further. So we can go up to 1024, 128, 170, 256 maxed out. Now, when you do fully max it out, it does turn off to no rotation. So do be aware of that, where you can go a little too far and it'll just basically shut itself off. Now, an important thing to note is once you do shut it off, either by going too fast or too slow, it's then decoupled. So if you want to like have a backup, you can then power that and it'll basically take whatever power it's given. So like by default, this 32 RPM is going to spin everything in the system at 32 RPM. Now, if I overpower this, which essentially decouples it, it's now taking the speed off of this speedometer and then moving at 16 RPM. So overall, this is an incredibly useful item. And like I said, integral to most aeronautics or simulated contraptions that are meant to be survival friendly and easily controlled via speed. And talking about easy control, we also have the steering wheel. Now what this does is it takes rotational input, which you can see is going down at the bottom right now. And then when you right click, you basically hold and you drag your mouse left and right, and you can control the angle of whatever it's connected to. So you can see we have this propeller up top, and we can easily change the pitch of it by just dragging around our wheel. Now by default, this is locked to 180, so we can turn it basically all the way around and it'll stop, turn it back to 0, and you can change our max rotation. So for instance, if this is like controlling the pitch of like a rear sail, we might only want this moving a few degrees, so we can turn it down to 45 degrees. So now the max it can turn is only to that 45-degree mark, which is really cool. They actually get that control in your wheel. The other really nice thing about the wheel is you can right click it with wood and recolor it. So you can have your wheel actually match the build you're making, which is always a really nice touch. Plus, it should be noted if you're activating the wheel while holding shift, you will move it exactly 45 degrees every time, which first is nice to move your contraption at 45 degrees, but also is a really easy way to like set yourself back to 0 because it actually snaps to those 45s, so you can very easily set yourself back to your straightforward position. So while there's still a lot to go through in the mod, I have gone through all of the basics about how to actually get your contraption working, and then most of the really integral tools. And before I move on to the rest of it, kind of go into like the redstone stuff, some other blocks, and then like the aeronautics and off-road specific items, I do want to talk about a few special items that didn't really fit into the other categories, but are definitely really important for your contraption. Now, the first and honestly the most important tool in your arsenal when you're building an airship or a plane or something is going to be the contraption diagram. Now the diagram is a real simple craft that's just a paper and a physics assembler, and when placed down it doesn't actually do anything. What we need to do is place it on a contraption. So you can see here I have a contraption, and if I place this down I can now right click it and you get a schematic of the contraption, and this looks so cool. Now in this menu, there's a few things you can do. First, you can rotate your contraption so you can see it from all your different sides. You can also rotate it up to see the top or down to see the bottom. Now, this is really cool on its own, but if you look at the left here, there's some other stuff that gives you some really nice information. So first, at the bottom, you have total mass, so that's the total weight of your contraption. So for instance, if you're building a balloon, you'll know exactly how much mass you need to offset with the lift of your balloon. Next is the center of mass. Now what this does is when you click it, it shows this little pip that shows the center of mass of your contraption. So you can see it's kind of right here in the back. And this is so important when you're building a contraption, because if you're building a plane, this is essentially the point where you're going to want to be like turning off of. Or if you're building an airship, you want your balloon directly above this because it's off to the side, you're going to be floating off in a weird direction. So center of mass is incredibly important. It's also important to know, if you look at it from the top, you can also see if your center of mass is aligned with the center of your contraption or not. Next up is force arrows. So by default, they're separate. You can do a merged version, but for now, we're going to keep that as separate. And then you have the configure diagram. So by default, levitation, balloon lift, propulsion, and lift are all on. You can also turn on magnetic force, drag, and gravity if you want. So what you can see is gravity already has the force shown. So you can see here, it puts this arrow in, and if I hover over it, it'll show me the gravity force of 123.75. Now, where this comes into play is for her to go ahead and power this up. It's going to power this fan, which is going to give us some thrust. And we can see here, propulsion force is now at 7.35. Now, this isn't enough to actually move our contraption, but we can see that it is like pushing it forward. Now, any of these other features, if I had them, so if I had balloon lift, it'll show that. If I had levitation, it'll show that. So a very useful tool to kind of get your force diagrams, your arrows, so you can see how your contraption is going to actually interact with the world. Now, an important thing to note about the contraption diagram is it's always going to be adjusted to kind of like the regular zero of your object. So I have this little mock-up of a plane at an angle, but it's still going to be shown normally like kind of level in your diagram. But as you can see, gravity force is going down. So your gravity and like your other forces will account for the angle that your contraption is at. It also should be noted, if you click and drag, you can make a little box that will zoom in to parts of your contraption. So you can like get a real nice zoom in on different parts of your contraption. The smaller the box, the closer it'll zoom in. The bigger box, the less it'll zoom in. But it's a really nice way, especially for big contraptions, to actually figure out what's going on, get like a real good view of your curves, and overall just be able to check out your contraption in more detail when that's what you need. And then the last neat thing about these diagrams is they can be placed in a 3x3 or a 2x2 or a 1x1 based on the size it has available. And something you might have noticed, if a player is actually standing on it, they will show up in your kind of schematic, which is so very cool. And honestly, one of the neatest features about this mod, in my opinion. Now, while this is a very, very simple plane that actually doesn't function, I am planning on doing a full guide to planes, which I've heard can be tricky to build. So that ultimate guide to planes is going to be really fun, and we're definitely going to go in depth and figure out how to like connect all these systems to make planes that actually work. So make sure you're subscribed for that. Now, next we have the linked typewriter. Now this isn't nearly as useful, but it's still a really cool tool, especially when you're building a big airship. Now what the linked typewriter does is you can do two different things. First, you can connect it to Redstone links, and what this does is it not only gives you one input, it gives you your entire keyboard as inputs. So for an example, I have this first one set up as light blue concrete powder. If I were to right click this, and let's just say we want that as 1, I can go ahead and drop that in. And now when I right click this, I'll be controlling it. And when I press 1, it will actually activate that redstone link. So you can see, you can basically have your entire keyboard of inputs to do all kinds of different stuff. Now you'll also notice that like, if I press 2, 3, 4, 5, because they're not bound, it's still going to activate my hotbar, but anything bound will no longer control your character. It will just control the typewriter. As you can see, it actually types out a key relative to where it is on the keyboard. So for instance, if I were to set something on the other side here, like let's just say the L key as our dark blue, go ahead and set that. Now when I right click this and I press the L key, you'll see like a key more towards that side gets activated, which is super cool. So like if you have a lot of stuff, you'll actually see your keyboard light up in different spots. Now in this menu, there are two other things to note. First, there is a list, so you can actually see the list of all the keys, and you can add them here if you wanted to, so you can bind any key you want. Now the neat thing about this is you can also do stuff like your keypad. So anything that doesn't appear in the UI, you can still set just by using the additional feature here. We can add it, and you can like do stuff to your keypad, do weird symbols. If you have like mouse buttons, this is where you would bind them here. The other thing is there is a delete button, which would delete all keybinds. So if you want a full reset, you can delete them there. And in survival, if the typewriter is picked up and placed back down, it will retain the same settings. So if you want to move this, you can very easily do that and keep the same settings that you set up. The other thing you can do with the typewriter is bind it to a display board. So if I right click my board, place it on my typewriter, I will bind those together. If I look at my typewriter, it'll be typed text. And the way this works is if I right click my typewriter, I can basically control it and type. So you can see I'm pressing a key and it's going to slowly update and type out that key. So I'm just pressing 1 a bunch, so it'll type that out. An important thing to note is right now I only have 1 and L bound, so I can actually only type with 1 and L. So if if I spam a bunch of these, you can see it typed out there. Now, if I wanted like my whole keyboard bound, I would have to actually go in here and, bind every single key, because by default, if I activate this and press like other keys, it won't actually do anything. It'll only work with that keys that are bound, so that 1 and that L. But super useful feature. Definitely could be used to like automatically update a display board, or just show the keys that you're pressing and kind of give you a feedback as towards what you're actually doing with your typewriter. And the last special thing I want to go over are these nameplates. So these nameplates are just basically signs. So you craft them up and you can place them on your contraptions. They can only go on the side of blocks. And the cool thing about this is the name actually changes for every single display board nameplate on a contraption. So you can see if I like edit this, call it name 1, you see all of these display boards update to the same nameplate text. And these also show up in the contraption diagram. So they show up first in person, which is super cool, but also on the bottom right, you can see the name of whatever contraption you're looking at. Now, for item movement upgrades, there's really only one tool that's added, and that is the Auger. Now, there's essentially 2 different versions of the Auger. First, there's the Auger Shaft, which is basically placed as a shaft, and it creates this little tube with a shaft input on either end. Now, when power is applied to one of those inputs, items will move through your auger. So if I drop this concrete in here, it will move its way through. So you can see in this one it has white concrete, now this one has white concrete, then eventually it'll pop to this one and then out the end. So it essentially just adds a new way to move stuff around. Now, what's actually really useful about this is it can also be vertical. So we now have a way to move things vertically without having to use a fan at the top sucking things up. You can just use an auger shaft to basically move things upwards on your contraption. And keep in mind, this is Create Aeronautics. You don't have to just move things up. If I put this on a physics contraption, I could have my auger at any kind of weird angle I want, going from like one ship to another, from my ship to the ground. There's lots you can do here with the auger shaft. Now, there is a second version of the auger, which is the auger cogwheel. Now, to get this, all you have to do is right click a shaft with a wrench and you get the auger cog. You can also just craft it using an auger shaft in your crafting inventory. And this works the same way as a shaft. If you power it with a cog from the side, it will then activate the auger cogwheel. Now, there is a neat thing about this, and that's that it actually gives input on which way it's going. So you can see we have like an off side and on side, and basically stuff is traveling from the unpowered to the powered side. So now if I drop this in here, it will then make its way this way, and we actually get an output with our goggles. We can see that it's moving 0.31 stacks per second. So we can see moving through here, and then out of our funnel. Now, with the auger cog, it is important to note that you cannot actually use it as an input. So you can't input stuff from the auger cog from the side, and you also can't input stuff for either the cog variant or the shaft variant from the end. Basically, because the shaft is there, you have to be inserting it from the side. So because I can't do it here, later on in the shaft, I can very easily input it and it will then run through our system. And finally, whenever attached to a drill or a harvester or like anything that's collecting blocks, it will collect those blocks into the auger shaft. So if I were to activate this little drill, it'll go forward, drill through the stone, and that stone, as you can see, is being collected automatically on our auger shaft. So it's a really nice way to automatically collect your resources from your drill all on a single contraption. And with that, we have the last section before we actually talk about aeronautics and off-road, and that is the redstone upgrades that create simulated ads. And the first one we have is the Redstone Inductor. Now what this does is it essentially delays the signal. So I have this analog lever. If I were to just max this all the way out to 15, you'll see it won't actually change immediately. It'll take a little bit of time to get there. And that setting is changed here. And essentially what it does is it changes how fast it takes to tick from one number to the next. So I would set this for 3 seconds and then basically take our power away. Every 3 seconds, our number will tick down. So it'll go 14, 13. After 3 more seconds, it'll go to 12, all the way down until it hits 0 where it'll stop. Now, in a similar vein, we also have the Redstone Accumulator. Now this works the exact same way, but instead of ticking down automatically, it ticks down with another input. So if I put this on, it'll slowly tick itself up to 15. And if I stop it, it'll hold at that level. It won't go down automatically. It'll only go down when it gets input from the side, and it'll go down at that rate you set. So you basically have an accumulation, which, it's a Redstone Accumulator, makes sense. So you can like slowly build up to 15 and then slowly work your way down with these controls. We also have an upgrade to our analog lever. So in Create, we have the analog lever where you can basically right click it once to basically change the redstone strength all the way up to 15, shift right click it to turn it down, which works really nicely. But Simulated adds the throttle lever. Now when right clicked, you get this really fine-tuned adjustment and you can basically just drag to whatever redstone signal you want. So if you basically like hooked this up to your propulsion system, you could like take this and like crank it all the way up or like pull it down a little bit and have very fine, very quick control of your redstone strength, which you can then use to control whatever contraptions you want. Now, next we have the modulating link receiver. And essentially what this does is it senses how close a redstone link is to the link receiver itself. Now this is set with a certain frequency, so I have this one set, and in here you can set your settings. So basically you can change your minimum and maximum range. So if you want like minimum 4, maximum, we'll just say like 14, we can set our range there, and you can actually see this little pip that's lit up is how far away this redstone link is. So if I were to move it into that range, you'll see by default it's 15, but if I move it into that range where it's more than 4 away, the number will start to go down. And we can see our little pip is now in that range. And we can see the further away we get, the lower strength we have coming out of the receiver. And if we're more than that maximum away, it'll essentially be off, like so. So it's a really nice way to control like, hey, is something in the range? And also how close is it in that range to the receiver itself? Now, in a similar vein, we also have the directional linked receiver. Now, what this does is it basically senses direction instead of how close it is. Directly in front of it, it gives a full redstone strength of 15, but then the further off center it gets, the lower the redstone strength, but we still get a redstone signal until it passes the point where it's no longer in front of the receiver itself and it's behind it. So anything behind it won't give a signal, but then in front of it will give a signal with a stronger strength the more forward it is, or like the more towards the very front of the linked receiver. So those are kind of the basic redstone upgrades, but now we're going to get to the stuff that's really going to affect how you build your contraptions and going to allow you to do some real cool automated controls. So first we have our altitude sensor. So what this does is it basically senses the altitude of your contraption. Now by default, it's basically your whole world height, -64 to 320. And there's two different versions. There's a bar version, and then if you right click with a wrench, you can turn it into this dial version. And the way this works is as I pull this up, our sensor is basically going to slowly change based on our altitude. So you can see like our dial sensor goes really fast, but the bar sensor goes a lot slower because essentially this bar is our minimum range to our maximum range. Now you do have the ability to actually change the signal range. So if I were to change it to the range of this little contraption here, so it is 102 to 108. Now this bar is actually going to show you how high it is basically in that range. So if I pull this all the way up, you see the bar moving a lot quicker now. And as it gets to the top, it gets right to the top of that bar. You can see the redstone strength also changes based on the altitude that you have it at. And similar to the altitude sensor, we also have a velocity sensor, which will tell you how fast your contraption is going. So I have this contraption here where I can turn it on and it'll move. You see we're moving at a speed of 3. Now, by default, what you'll notice is it'll always power the side, basically the opposite side of direction. So we're moving that way, it'll power the thing on the other side. And if we move faster, we will see that the number does get a lot higher. So if I'm like really cooking, you can see that it'll max out at 15. Now you can change the max speed. So that's basically changing what 15 will be. Right now it's 10 meters per second. You can go all the way up to 50 meters per second. And you can also change if it's away or towards. So if I change it to towards and basically raise this up a little bit, even at the max speed of this contraption, you see it won't quite get to 15, but it will be on that towards sensor instead of the away sensor. Next, we have the gimbal sensor. Now what the gimbal sensor is going to do is it's basically going to try to like level itself out. So if I were to like raise one side of our contraption here, essentially what it'll do is it'll give a redstone signal on the side facing away from the sensor. So basically we're like tilting on this angle, it'll give a signal on the downside of that angle. Now this also works at weird angles. So if I were to pull this lever in, you see we're now like facing down this angle. and our gimbal sensor is kind of forced that way, it'll basically give a redstone signal on this side and this side. So you can basically use this to use redstone controls to either like signal how level your thing is or automatically, like change these pistons, or if you're using like a helicopter, you can change like how the blades are rotating to make sure that your system is leveled out. And our last kind of automated sensor like this is the navigational table. Now what this does is it'll basically give a redstone signal pointing towards whatever it's navigating to. Now there are a few different options. First is the map. So if you use a map and you right click on a banner, basically it'll place that banner on your map. And then when placed in your navigational table, it'll navigate you towards that banner. So you can see it not only gives like a little pointer that shows you where to go, and if I were to like turn our machine here, the pointer will stay pointing that way, but it'll also give a redstone signal that way. So it'll be like 15 if it's maxed out, going straight that direction, and it'll go down from there. And then it does the same thing as our gimbal sensor, where it'll give like a smaller strength to two different sides if it's facing a corner like this. The next option is a compass, which points you towards world spawn, a lodestone compass, which can be bound to a lodestone, and then finally a recovery compass, which will point you towards your last death point. And then we have the optical sensor. Now what the optical sensor does is it senses distance. So basically we have a block here, it senses that, hey, there's a block in the way, and it'll also give a redstone strength output based on the distance. So if it's real close, it'll be 15, and then the further away, the lower that signal strength is gonna get. And you can also adjust this on the back of the block. So if I were to like go here and set it to 4, it'll now only sense the 4 blocks in front of the optical sensor. Anything past that won't be sensed. And finally, you also have a filter at the top. So you can filter out a block of any type and it'll look for that block. So right now we're looking for green concrete, red concrete, or like any other block will give no signal. But then if it does sense green concrete, it will give a signal. So while all of these give you a really nice automatic control based on how a contraption is interacting with the world, we also have one that gives the player a lot more control, and that is the laser pointer and the laser sensor. Now, this works exactly how you'd expect. If you apply a redstone signal to a laser pointer, it'll shoot out a beam of light, which can then be contacted with a laser sensor, giving that redstone signal power through your contraption. Now, laser pointers can be blocked, so any like solid block will block the laser pointer, but transparent blocks will not block the pointer. So you can see a glass block allows the laser pointer to go right through. Now, laser pointer strength is actually transferred. So you can see as I like slowly turn this analog lever on, we get like our 1 strength, strength of 2, all the way up to our 15. And also our beam is also controlled. So you see it gets more opaque the higher the strength is, and then less opaque the lower the strength is. Now, because the strength doesn't actually affect how far the pointer goes, you do have a casting distance here, where you can set basically the max distance the laser pointer will go. So you can set it real low at like 1 or 2, and even at like max power here, you see it won't actually impact our laser sensor. But if I like bump it up to the point where it can reach, it will reach. Now, a really neat thing is you can actually dye your laser pointer by just using dye on the block itself, and it dyes your beam, and you can do all 16 different colors. Now, by default, any laser sensor will accept any color. However, if I put a color filter in here, it will only accept that color. So if I put a yellow filter in here, it will only accept a laser pointer that is also painted yellow. Same thing like with any color. So if I change it to blue, I have to make this laser pointer blue in order for the redstone signal to go through. Now, a really neat feature is a black laser pointer. Instead of being a black light, it's actually invisible. So you see our power still transfers through, and if we like dye this, it doesn't work unless it's black. And it's a really powerful way. If you want to have an invisible sensor, you can use a black laser pointer and it'll automatically be able to transfer power completely invisibly, which is super cool. And with that, that covers everything for Create Simulated, and we now get to jump into Create Aeronautics and take a look at the specific items added by the mod that'll help you build airships and planes and things that fly. First, we're going to talk about the hot air burner and the hot air envelope, which allows you to essentially make a hot air balloon. So the way the hot air burner works is when you turn it on with a redstone signal, it will basically turn on the fire inside and send heat up into an envelope that you create. Now to create an envelope, you're essentially just making an empty space inside. So you can see that in here, that's basically my empty space. That's where hot air is going to collect. As it heats up, it'll actually change the texture in there. So you can kind of see that like waviness on like the sides of the block that shows you that, hey, there's actually heat inside there. And we can verify this by looking at our contraption diagram, and we see that we now have balloon force lift of 27. So that means that there's hot air going into here, and that hot air is going to do a balloon lift and essentially create an upwards lift for your contraption. Now, if we look here, we have a gravity force of 200 and a balloon lift force of only 27, so this is not enough hot air to make this contraption go up. But if I were to activate this one, we are going to have enough lift force. So you can see it'll slowly start gathering hot air, and eventually, once we outweigh gravity, so gravity is 300, you can see it'll start to kind of shake, and then it'll actually start to go up. And you can see here on our altitude meters, we are now soaring into the sky, and our contraption will go up. Now, the really nice thing is the further you go up, the less dense the air is, which essentially means that there's going to be a certain point where the balloon stops going up. So if I look here, you can see that our balloon lift force is slowly going down. And that's because the air is thinner up here, so the balloon is able to push up less. And eventually, when these two even out, the contraption will slow down and eventually stop moving up. Now, if I wanted to control my height, I can actually do that with the hot air burner. Now, the way we do that is we control the amount of hot air that goes into the balloon. So if I look at my burner with goggles, we can see the gas output. We can also see the fill and the total volume. So our balloon volume is 38 cubic meters, and we can set our maximum volume here on the hot air output. And what that allows us to do is give a different power output to basically change the amount of hot air this is able to produce. So by default, it kind of maxes out. We've set that at 40. But if I were to like slow this down a little bit, so lower the redstone signal, you'll notice our balloon will start dropping. And if we look at our hot air burner with my goggles on, we can see that our fill is slowly going down because we're allowing less hot air into our balloon itself. Now I can control this up. So if we go up to like 12, you'll see it'll start to fill up again and eventually start floating. Now you also see that yellow bar, and that's basically showcasing how much it's going to be filling up to. So if I lower this, you can see the bar actually can go below our fill, or if I raise it, it can go above, and basically it'll just kind of slowly work to hit that yellow line. So you can see right now, it's kind of hit that yellow line and it's gonna stop filling up. And if you are wearing your goggles and you look at your altitude sensor, you can actually get a readout of the specific air pressure you're at, which is kind of neat because you can actually see it changing as you go up or down. Now, a really important thing to note is aeronautics is actually going to calculate the amount of air in your balloon. Now, what that means is if you have a hole, you can see that the air actually falls out of your balloon and you will lose altitude. So very important to note that you want to make sure that you have all holes patched up and you're actually creating a full volume, because if you have any holes in there, hot air will just escape and then your balloon won't be able to fly. And there's a really cool little animation associated to you. You get this like puff of air whenever you lose air in your balloon. Two other things to note about the envelopes is they can be dyed by right-clicking it with dye. Now, if I right-click twice, it'll basically create this like plus pattern, so it'll like dye a larger area. And if I right-click 3 times really fast, it'll dye the entire balloon. So you can very quickly dye an entire balloon like that, or just like sections. Like if I want to like slowly dye parts of it brown, that's very easy to do. Now, envelopes do have to be built out of hot air envelopes. However, there is a neat feature that the mod adds, and that's where if you have a shaft going through a balloon, you can actually use a hot air envelope as a casing, which will make it airtight. So by default, your balloon won't be airtight, basically only this top level would be, but if I have that balloon as a casing, now it's airtight all the way down. But do keep in mind any shafts or like any other blocks you place inside here will reduce the total amount of air that it's able to hold inside the balloon. Now, for bigger ships, we have the steam vent. Now, the steam vent works the same way as the hot air burner, but the hot air burner has a maximum size of 500 cubic meters. So that's the max balloon size it can go. But the steam vent has a max balloon size of 5,000 cubic meters. So this is really what you're going to want to use if you're building a massive balloon. And if you have a balloon that has over 5,000 cubic meters, you can actually just add another one of these steam vents and double your output. So that's a nice way to like really get a nice control and fill up a volume. Now the steam vents work the same way as steam engines do, where they actually need a supply of steam. So you do need a tank with water being pumped in and a heat source below it. But once you do that, you will be able to turn on your steam vent and fill up a volume. So you can see your steam vent is on and our contraption is slowly generating lift and will eventually have enough lift force to lift this airship off the ground. You can see right here, we're getting close. Airship's starting to like be really light, and after a little bit, it's going to actually take off. And you can see our airship is now flying. And this one really is a little too small to actually need a steam vent, but as you can imagine, your big ships, that's going to be a lot nicer to have steam vents versus like a whole bunch of the burners. And if you're not a fan of the gold steam vent, you can right click it with an iron sheet to get this other variant. We kind of have this like dark gray metal, which is really neat. Now there's so much more detail I can go into for airships, like how to actually make them move in a smart way, how you set up your controls, how to set up a system to like automatically raise and lower it, dock it, stuff like that. And I'm going to be doing a full ultimate guide to airships in a future video. So make sure you subscribe for that because it's going to be a really fun one and we're going to learn a lot together in that video. So next we have the propeller bearing. Now what the propeller bearing does is essentially gives thrust based on spinning a propeller. Now this is a standalone bearing, which you can then attach blocks to, and it'll work just like a regular crate bearing, except it'll generate thrust with any blocks that would work as a propeller. Those blocks are the regular windmill sails, the symmetric sails, and wool. So if I build this out and then we go ahead and glue this together, we can go ahead and activate our clutch and we can see our propeller is spinning. Now what you'll notice is the direction of those kind of like air particles is the direction of the thrust. So if I look at here, we have propulsion force down. We want this going up. We have two ways we can change that. First, we can activate a clutch, which will reverse the direction. You can see it's now going up. The other option is on the device itself, you can change it with a little thrust direction. So it can be backwards or forwards, depending on what you need. Now what you'll notice is this doesn't overcome gravity. We only have a force of 86 and our gravity is 154 on this contraption. So if I go ahead, turn this off, right click my bearing to set it back to the world, add another set of windmills. We can now see that our propulsion force is enough to actually take off and start flying. Now air pressure does affect these contraptions just like our airships, so depending on how far up it goes, it will slow down. But as you can see, we can essentially have a contraption that can fly itself or act as a way to push another system forwards. Now there's another type called the gyroscopic propeller bearing. Now what this does is it always tries to keep itself upright. So as you saw with that other one, it got tilted and just kind of took off because it was now giving force at a slight angle, and then it's going to continue at that angle. But the gyroscopic propeller bearing will always keep itself upright. So if we power this, we can see even though our contraption is weighted wrong, our propulsion force is always going to be stuck fully upright. So if we like look here and we go ahead and add our gravity line, you see it's basically always opposite of gravity. So it'll always basically keep itself upwards. This is what you would want to use if you're building a helicopter or something else that needs to stay upright. Now, alongside the block-built propellers, we also have two propellers that are single blocks. We have the wooden propeller and the andesite propeller. Now, these are just aesthetic differences. You actually craft the wooden propeller by using the andesite propeller. And if I go ahead and activate this machine, you see that they provide the exact same propulsion force up. Now, with the single block propellers, we also have a new one called the smart propeller. Now, this works the exact same way as a gyroscopic propeller bearing, but only for one angle of movement. So you see we kind of have the center shaft here, and if I activate this contraption, it will keep itself upright on that line. However, like I said, this only works on that angle. So if I were to like replace this and move our netherrack to the side and then activate it, it will actually be offset and won't work. So it is important to note that you can use these and they will balance themselves out one way, but not the other. So while those propellers are great for helicopters and airships, they can also be used to make planes. Now, the cool thing about planes is we have a new type of sail called the symmetric sail. So we have the regular windmill sail, which you can place as your wings on your contraption, and they will essentially provide a bit of lift. You see that it actually like angles itself upward. It's actually providing lift from those sails. Now, unlike windmill sails where they have like the one empty side, symmetric sails have a sail on both sides. And what they do is they basically try to like keep the direction of movement in one solid direction. So I turn this plane on and then activate it. Our symmetric sail in the middle is going to keep it facing in one direction. So like it's not going to turn off to either side. I mean, it can, but it's a lot harder, and that symmetric sail is going to keep it going in that same direction. Now, as we know, contraptions with end stone attached do float. And if I go ahead and look at this with a contraption diagram, you can see that we have a levitation force of 22, which is enough to overcome essentially one block. If I were to build more blocks on here, it won't be able to overcome that and will fall to the ground. So if you wanted something to levitate with a bit more force, we have Levitite. And as you can see here, Our Levitite will counteract a lot more blocks. So we have a whole bunch of blocks attached here. I can even add more, and our Levitite will still be floating. So you can see it's overcoming that gravity force of the larger platform. And it's essentially 5 times stronger than Endstone. Endstone only has floating with 2, where Levitite has floating with 10. So you can have a lot more platform or ship blocks with a lot less actual blocks to keep your contraption afloat. And there's also a second variant, the pearlescent Levitite, and it's just basically a pink version of the same block. Now, while Levitite is super cool, it does have one quirk that does make it a little tough to work with, and that's that it cannot be mined. So you see when I mine it by hand, the block just breaks. We don't actually get it back. This works the same with our pearlescent Levitite, cannot be mined. Now keep in mind, this doesn't mean it cannot be moved. Because this is Create Aeronautics, we can simply assemble it and then drag it around our world wherever we want it to go. Now you'll notice as I'm moving this around, there's a little barrier that kind of shows up above the block, and then basically creates a little bit of drag at slow speeds. Now this is overcame the faster you go, so like if you get a machine actually moving quick, that won't be in effect, but at slow speeds it does reduce the amount of speed that a contraption can move at. Now, you might be wondering, if I can't pick up Levitite, how does it get crafted? Now, it all starts with a Levitite blend, which is crafted from mixing endstone powder, which is just crushed endstone, zinc, and water. You mix that together and you get your Levitite blend. Now, the last thing you need to do to actually form it into the blocks is you need to heat it up. So this can be done with a campfire, which will essentially heat it up, and then as one block is heated, it will basically cause other blocks around it to cure and then form solid Levitite. And for pearlescent Levitite, essentially you just need to use a soul source. So soul torches or soul campfires. If I place this down, you'll see this block will turn into the pearlescent Levitite. And then after that, any pearlescent Levitite will form pearlescent Levitite around itself. Now, because this can't be picked up, you really want to cast the exact shape you want to use. So here I have a basin of Levitite. And one thing really fun here you'll notice is that I'm not touching any buttons, and yet I'm floating in the Levitite. Levitite essentially doesn't let you fall through it. So you can like press shift if you really wanted to go down in it, and you will start drowning. But you basically float at whatever height your player is at, which is really neat. Now with this casting basin, if I wanted to cast this chunk of Levitite, you can then, apply your heat source and let it cast. And what's going to be really neat is if you use clay or some other blocks, as a Levitite heats up and forms, the blocks around it actually go away. So you can see all of our clay is popping off as a Levitite is forming, and we'll be left with just our Levitite chunk once all of the Levitite has formed into our pearlescent Levitite. And of course, this does work with both versions, not just the pearlescent. And last but not least, we have the mounted potato cannon. Now what the mounted potato cannon does is it works like a potato cannon, but it's mounted in your world. Now there's 2 things you need to do to make this work. First, you got to charge it up, and that's just done with a power input from the side. And once it's fully charged, you give it a redstone signal, and it will fire. So you can see as it charges up, there's this little buffer that actually fills up. Once it's full, you can press the button and it will fire. And of course, this can be fully automated. So you can input items in with a hopper or a chute. You can give a belt speed to power it up. And then if you give it a solid redstone signal, it'll be fully automated and just fire off as soon as it can. So this is a way to make a fully automated weapon on your airship if that's what you desire. And finally, we come down to Create Offroad, which adds a few different blocks that basically allow you to make cars in Minecraft. Now, before I get to the actual wheels and stuff, I do want to go over the rock cutting wheel and the Borehead bearing. Now, the way these work is that you have the Borehead bearing, which spins with power from the side of the block, and it basically spins like a bearing. But the cool part is when you attach these rock cutting wheels to it, they act as a mining drill, but instead of just mining the block in front of them, they mine like a 3x3 area around them. So if we go ahead and power this up, you see that it goes forward and it's going in a circle, and you can see like it's mining a whole section out. So this is a really good way to mine out a lot of space all at once automatically. The other really nice thing is you can see here that we have a chest on here, so it's basically collecting the materials automatically, and you can pull stuff out of the bearing using a funnel. So you can automatically have a mining contraption do your mining and collect your materials on the same contraption. So if you wanted to build a really cool mining drill, this is a fantastic way to do it. And then last but not least, we have the wheel mount and 4 different sizes of wheel. So the wheel mount places down as a block, and you can basically attach wheels to it. There are 4 different sizes of wheel. You have small, medium, large, and monstrous, and these basically work as a wheel on your contraption. So when you right click it on a wheel mount, it places down the wheel, and then as your contraption moves, the wheel will kind of turn and spin with your contraption. Now you can power these through the back. So if I were to just power this up with a motor, you see I can basically turn the wheel, so you can automatically be driving your car. And they also have a built-in turning system. So if you apply redstone to one side, it'll turn the wheel towards that side. Apply it to the other side, it'll turn the wheel towards that side. So you can have like automatic built-in steering into your contraption. And of course, the redstone strength you give this actually affects how far it turns. So you see, as I slowly pull this analog lever, it's going to turn a little bit further, the more redstone strength it has. And this does work as a combination. So if we have like this really high, but then we give it a little power on this side, it'll turn back towards that side. So you get a really fine control over your wheel. And the final thing the wheel mount does is you have a setting here for suspension strength. And this is going to basically affect how springy your contraption is. So for instance, I have this little car I built over here. By default, suspension strength is 10. So if I pick it up, you see it's like kind of bouncy. Well, very bouncy. And if I were to raise our suspension strength all the way up, it'll no longer be nearly as bouncy. So I lifted all the way up, and now when I lift it and drop it, you see it's a lot less bouncy. And using your tires, you can very easily create little cars. So you can see here, I've created a car, and I'm not actually using the tires themselves, but I'm using a torsion spring kind of in the center here to act as my steering. But you can see you can very easily build little cars that you can drive around your world. And they're just getting kind of roll, like the wheels work just as wheels. And just like I'm planning to cover airships in more detail in a future video, I'm definitely going to be covering cars and trucks and tanks in a future video, so make sure you're subscribed for that, because there's a lot more detail I can go into, and I'm definitely looking forward to making my ultimate guide to cars and trucks and stuff like that. And that's going to be it for my ultimate guide to Create Aeronautics. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was so much fun to make, figure out the mod, and play around with all the features, and we'll definitely be digging further into it, building airships and planes and helicopters and drones and all kinds of fun stuff like that. So with that, I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.